much. I'd like to thank you in particular. I just pressed the button, it's being recorded. And also I'd like to thank everyone that's behind the scenes who's doing as much work as possible in a very, I think, confused situation, although it's not tense. Friedel Hoffman, I have met before in my life. So I again thank him very much. It is, of course, as Mohammed knows very well, over at least 2 years of frenetic emails, shall we say, not because of him and not because of his country and not because of the country he's sitting in right now, but because of the country I'm sitting in under about, quite frankly, the degrees as is ungefähr 30 Grad here. So pardon me if I have some iced tea next to me from time to time. I've shut all doors so it will be hotter. And the situation here is, as you know, who read international news, still very difficult for us. And I felt the best thing is to present an oral presentation, although it's written to be sure, and concentrate on Ramesses II and Kadesh. And I'd like to introduce that sort of subject for you so you know where I'm going. And at least it's nice that the passengers know where the driver is going, where he or she began, and where the aim of the trip is. And as Mohammed did say, the last two books in 2019 and 20 had their genesis through other means, but I would say, quite frankly, it was unpredictable how the first one would turn out, which is really a psychological framework, not that much historical. And the second, which led off from it, I felt was necessary, which is to delve down into the source material behind the various pharaohs. In this case, I did choose more in the second volume than the first. The question of points of view derives from that second volume. It's really to say, and I will give you just the introduction at this moment, is to say it's an extension of the concept of the personality of the king as expressed by a literary artist. We are talking about literature, and this is something that to a degree outsiders, shall we say, non-Egyptologists, for whatever group they belong to, does not matter, that they don't realize that the Battle of Kadesh in the so-called poem is something that is not simply a piece of documentary evidence. It isn't an unadulterated or indeed an adulterated point of view that you might see on television or in early days in a movie or in a historical novel such as War and Peace, for example. It's created at the court. It's a byproduct of a lengthy tradition that seems to have emerged in the Ramesside period, specifically for lengthy compositions that are written on stone. And this was one of the points I want to stress here that I did earlier in the most recent study, namely that this is literature, but it is not literature on papyri. It is not literature in soft copies. It is literature otherwise. And to a degree, that aspect of the New Kingdom, and in particular of the 19th and 20th dynasties, is somewhat recent in the field of Egyptology, namely the emphasis on literature coming from monumental royal inscriptions. I can honestly say that there's one major center, and that would be Liege, for example. I mean, center in Europe at this point, I'm stressing. And also I have to stress that my own work is dependent upon many people from there, as well as from Andreas Stauder, who of course originally derives from Basel, but is now not at all in Switzerland, of course, is in France. And these are, if you will, the younger group, not my age. They're not at all even in my decades. But nevertheless, the new interpretation of Egyptian literature should be stressed at this moment because it's been overlooked when you deal with inscriptions. And so studies of points of view have been in other fields a revealing strategy in the analysis of literary compositions of the ancient world. The focus established by the author entailed a certain method of presentation, and the classic one is between the first and the third person, to which can be added the format, of course, we versus I. In some cases, the lines are unforgettable. The shipwrecked sailors, our land, we have reached it. Or Ahmose, the son of Abanas, I was at the front of my troops, our troops, excuse me. This group aspect of military men, whether they be sailors or warriors on land, has been perfectly rendered by the first person plural. In royal military compositions, Identity is most keenly felt in the duality of the third person employed in creating the official records that were based upon royal day books, where the underlying structure made it a simple matter to deduce, explain, and analyze the events and actions of the king. Considerably more complicated are the cases where a text deals with the king's reactions to startling events and his first-person comments, as in the poem of Ramesses II. And so we can reach the real question of the two and the one really major inscription, which is Ramesses II. And he does apply a new means, or at least what I call a third means of description, very different from that of the 18th dynasty, say Thutmose III, but other pharaohs as well. Different from that of his father, Seti I, I would say definitely there in Seti's smaller inscriptions. By and large, the poem has been dealt with philologically, and I would have to stress that Thomas van der Waal would have to be the prime person that one turns to. Otherwise, it is used as a source of historical information, often, I think, taken too literally or taken too, shall we say, strict a matter of what is occurring. You have to stand back, and you have to realize it's not merely standing back by a so-called altogether general term that I detest, propaganda. Those of you that have probably read the Masks books knows that even in the introduction, I have a jibe against that overuse. I see it as the personality of the pharaoh coming in, interacting with, controlling, or allowing someone to write for him, approving that document, which is a literary composition, having it read out loud, having it read shall we say, silently by others, and eventually being placed, or quickly being placed, on a wall, on a temple wall. And in this case, it's the Temple of Abydos that I claim would be the first temple that would have on this exterior wall, perfectly rendered there already, the Battle of Kadesh and the poem. Now, I separate the poem purposely here because basically, as I tried to explain earlier, following others to be sure, the poem is a literary masterpiece. It's a separate document, however. It's separate from the visual or pictorial nature that you might wish to contemplate. I am not analyzing or contemplating the pictorial evidence at all, and I'm not trying to link in and say that the poem is here in the visual nature. The visual nature is expressed in words, in the written. That is not my interest. It is not merely a complement of the visual, it's a separate document, totally different. And it would have had to circulate in some form, in soft copy, within a court milieu. That was one of my final conclusions in the Masks book. That is, in the Masks book, I've argued for the development of a new Ramesside type of narrative format. It isn't my creation. It goes way back to 1959 to Edward Wenty. It carries over by other scholars in the 1980s. It's dropped and now has been taken up again by Jean Vinard, that have another prominent modern young Egyptologist, where the narrative format, the structure of narration, the structure, if you will, of sequential narration is in a format different hitherto expected, and it's different from his father. So I see something very interesting occurring in the reign of Ramesses II. It is this Hittite attack that leads you to view, as I think Miriam Lichtheim did, and she was ignored, that the Battle of Kadesh in the poem is an epic. It isn't propaganda. It's an epic like, shall we say, the Iliad is an epic of one person, right? The Wrath of Achilles. It's not an epic of the 10-year war against the Trojans. It's an epic centered at a specific time, place, and person. And the emotions of the person come out in the Iliad as the emotions of the person, the pharaoh, come out in the poem. There's an identity there that undoubtedly made Miriam Lichtheim stress more than once in her second volume of Ancient Egyptian Literature that this is a new way of historical narrative presentation. Unfortunately, as we know, that she only uses the terms and expresses them within basically one volume, the second volume of her literature book, and with at most 2 or 3 pages. But she does stress it with Ramesses II later on with Merneptah's Israel stela, because you have a similar parallel there. And to a degree, although she could have done much more, I do it with Ramesses III in his various inscriptions at Medinet Habu. That's the key group, really, right in the core of the 19th/20th dynasty, middle 19th, early 20th, and where you see the same structure of narrative format presented. The vocabulary is different. The attitudes of all three pharaohs, Merneptah, Ramesses II, Ramesses III, are different. The purpose is different. The pathos, the not quite tragedy, but the almost tragedy, the disaster that he had to face at Kadesh is not repeated by these other two pharaohs. Nevertheless, you have the point of view, and you have it developed very early. So I'll just now go into essentially the structure of what is there. The structure is very simple, and it was certainly known to Gardner in his famous short little orange-covered book, Kadesh Inscriptions, namely that you begin in the third person. You have an impersonal account, if you will. The omniscient narrator is there. And at a certain point, it's in the P series, around 74 or so, you turn to the first person and you carry it on to the end, and then you return to the third person and king goes home. The crux is when the king is actually in the field. In fact, it's when he's in his camp. In fact, he's on the west of it and he hears the information. This is the high point. If to stress that in the poem, the complementary lengthy text of the Battle of Kadesh, the so-called bulletin, is solely interested in that. The bulletin is not interested in the events leading up to the camp, not interested in the end of the day, the first day. Not at all is the bulletin, interested in day two. It's not interested in the return trip. It's not interested in the god Amun. It's not interested in any piety a la Asman, whether you accept Asman or not. It's interested in the question of, oh, we have now determined a disaster is looming. The Hittites have crossed the river Orontes. They've crossed, obviously it's known, and they're coming to us. This is the disaster. And so that's the specific, lengthy narrative historical text that is literary that complements the poem, but it stands side by side with the poem, because within the poem you have the personality of the pharaoh in the first person expressing points of view. And the points of view are now as follows. You have what is called the internal aspects of an individual being, if you will, narrated in there. If you will, what is called in literary terms, focalization. Not linguistic focalization, but the focalization that is upon the text presentation. You are in the situation of the king. He's speaking in the first person. He's looking though, and that's the exterior aspect of internal focalization. You're not above the pharaoh, you're with or in. If you're very emotional, you're right in him, you feel with him. And he's looking out, so that's exterior. And sometimes he also is interior in himself, because he's commenting on, at least exterior-wise, what he feels the soldiers were, his administrators were, what they all were. Worthless, of course. And his fear there is transformed, it has to be, to the idea of loyalty that he has, and this is the stress, not propaganda, but loyalty to his godfather. Those around him, those who were the administrators, did not show the loyalty. So the focalization of the pharaoh is what matters in the poem. This is not present earlier in any, so that I would have to honestly say, text of the New Kingdom, where you have that focalization. I am strictly relying upon monumental royal inscriptions, whether they be military or not. You could argue, although I won't do it here, that Kamosa forms a parallel, but that will be part of the published version. I do deal with Mr. Kamosa at the beginning, as well as Mr. Thutmose III. But for this is after all a Ramesside conference, and I want to keep within an agreed amount of time. I am not going to wax eloquently about the speech structure. There's one speech after another of Kamosa. Ramesses doesn't do that. He doesn't address one speech here, back and forth. His indications are to provide the reader or the listener with his emotions from an internal point of view, from an internal focalization. And that's how the narrative system is operating in the text. The historically arranged narrative stops in its normal third person, if you will, bland or structural normal approach of an omniscient narrator, and gets to a metrically organized core, except when I use that term, even in the book core, the core is like 85 to 90% of the text. The text is the core. It's, in a sense, has two bookends, beginning and end. And in that core, you're in the first person, and you're in the focalization of the first person. The Ramesses character, or really hero, if you will, tragic hero, he does succeed. He's not tragic in a Greek sense, but he is tragic because he's caught, unexpected. This is his point of view, to be sure. I'm not going any further. And this is, in a sense, a newer stage in the development of narrative presentation in military texts. I would be more than happy to see it occurring equally at the same time or earlier in a non-military context in a royal inscription of more than 20 or 30 or 40 lines. I like a long text. I don't think it will be found because the uniqueness of Kadesh is there. It is that unique aspect that renders the poem a piece of literature, a true piece of literature. If it's written, it needs to have an audience and it needs to have some circulation. And we at least can argue from the Kadesh poem, it did have circulation. We have papyri copies, correct? Two. The Zawiyet Umm is the obvious one, and the one at Deir Medina is the other one. So there's a copy floating around at Deir Medina too. These are not versions that Pentaweret, the copyist of the poem that we have, or back in Deir Medina. These are not copies from the walls. These are copies of copies. They're circulating. And once it's there, there's a question of who has it, why do they have it, and the like. I claim that this is a byproduct or an expansion of court-inspired texts dealing with the king. Quite often I call them encomia, because we do have quite a number of the Ramesside miscellanies that parallel in narrative structure the Kadesh texts, the Merneptah texts, the Ramesses III texts. It's all in the court. And with the miscellanies that are devoting themselves to the great pharaoh, let us say Merneptah, because he's there a lot, but also other papyri of a eulogistic nature from Dynasty 20. It's very clear that this is a product of the court. It's a literary segment of society that I think many people took for granted, that is, many Egyptologists did, and that's all. They didn't feel anything more than that. They didn't actually try to perceive how is that operative in the court by the people. Who are the people? Not just the writer or the writers of the compositions, but actually how are they reacting to the great autocrat? Because I call him quite bluntly an autocrat. I'm obviously viewing him as a Russian czar there, but that's what it is, and that's what he is. There is not really freedom per se, and I think that Egyptologists tend to overlook that. How did these people, not the generals, not the vizier, but how did these people interact with one another and the king about this published information, about this published literature that is extolling the pharaoh, especially when it's very personal, such as the Battle of Kadesh. And this is what I call the third stage. I actually developed the stages in the entire points of view, stressing Ramesses' dedication, his declaration that he's always following Amun. I think most of us know this in a sense the first time we read the composition, but you have to remember that it is nothing before it's written, and it's written through the inspiration of a writer, a literary artist, and it's been approved. It has to be approved. There is a censorship going on there. And it is that segment in the middle that we do have the king making his evaluation long after the battle, of course. And this is edited. it would be nice to know when is the first time that this text is on a wall. If it would be nice, it would be year 10, maybe 8. I'm sure Egyptologists are going to really argue, as I did to some degree, roughly in the end of the first decade. But it would be nice to know before that, when it actually was, in a sense, like this portion of my manuscript I have in the hand. And the desire of the king through his focalization relating to his point of view of the narrator. And therefore, it reduces to me a piece of literature with a creative writer choosing a strategy. That is the strategy, perhaps pressed by the king or given certain aspects by the king, but establishing that strategy. And so I considered the classic case of a dichotomy of exterior versus interior in order to establish the key differences between the use of the third person, say Thutmose III and Ramesses II, and the first person in Kamose. There's a difference. It isn't merely third versus first or first person plural, like in Shipwreck Sailor, when I began the text, or in fact in Marines. Texts of dealing with the Navy will often always have first person plurals, that I expect, or expeditions. But it's rather the writer who clearly is creating an emotion based on danger, not necessarily fear, but danger. And I think that's behind the piety that is generated by the king's invocation to Ammon, and of which, of course, the writer wants and is focalizing on it. But it is a very different personally directed, shall we say, narrative than Kamose's, which is equally abusive, in fact. Ramesses isn't abusive. It's just the difference that comes through. And in Ramesses' case, they may, like Kamose, speak in the first person, but his focalization is very different. How soon thereafter is really a question. I think it's done within a year. I think most people would say he comes home and he's going to emblazon his great victory at Kadesh in a written format that's monumentalized on stone for eternity. But it's also going to be, in a sense, for eternity in the oral/written culture of Pharaonic Egypt, of where we move to the literary Egyptological school. I can't escape it. Now, if I were to really go further, I would list certain characteristics. So I'll give you at least some of them from the poem itself. It clearly is a first-person core narrative with interior focalization. The interior focalization is visual, so it's outside the body. It's directed outside the, if you will, soma of the living person, of the pharaoh, but it's also internal. He's got internally oriented perspective, and that is crucial. And that is how he has to deal with his isolation. It's really that isolation that he's stressing, or the author wants to stress. The account, though, is metrically presented. And here one must almost laugh at the fact that the term poem that was ignored and rejected for a long time, Gardner is one in 1960, is actually correct. It is a poem. It's a metrical epic presentation. It is not lyric. It's not difficult. It is narrative. It has narrative formations, has sequential narrative formations. It's aiming to describe the events as they occurred and to describe the success of the king at the end. And then he moves on into the second day, which I don't wish to discuss. I believe that it reflects a major change that occurs in the early Ramesside period, and is one that can be seen in the use of a different sequential system than that of late Egyptian. That's crucial. So within a specifically decided poetical rendition, you have a somewhat different way of presenting a narrative sequence. Not as much as Merneptah will do, and not as much as will be presented in those Merneptah, shall we say, dated late Egyptian miscellanies, and not as much as even in written monumental format as is present on the war records of Ramesses III at Medinet Habu, but they're there too. And I think we are at the beginning of the stage for that. I would have to say, I would sidestep the type and origin of this narrative here. It isn't really concerning me per se. What it is, though, is to stress for the audience that may be already converted, but I think maybe not converted enough, or not pure enough, that this is a poetical literary piece. So please take it that way first. This is what I would have to say to any Assyriologist. Don't assume that even everything which is neatly presented there to slice through the second division. I have no idea how it occurred. Is it the top, the middle, or the rear of prey? What happened? It's just a slice. It's convenient historically because it gets the chariots through the second division and right to the camp of Ramesses II. But this is, of course, a literary presentation, and the word, of course, is a literary word. It's worth to slice. As you have a tranche de vie, you have a slice of life, you have a slice with shot through the second one. And everyone says, how did this happen? It's a good question. They're marching with troops that are chariots on front and right, left, front, and back. They're there. Or even more, how did Muwatallis, the Hittite king, understand that the first attack had failed somehow? And how long did it fail? And sends his second divisions following Claude Obzoma. He's sending them directly across from Kadesh, the old, north of the city of Tel Nebimend. They're going across the river. They're still crossing the Orontes, but in a direction different from that of many Egyptologists. This is the second attack. How did he see it? The visual nature of the Egyptian pictorial evidence has them looking back, remember, at Ramesses, and his chariots have been defeated, or at least pushed back. Ramesses is approaching the river, it seems, of Orontes. But this is a literary presentation in the poem and a visual presentation of the artists. Again, commissioned through the royal court with the royal approval, with the censorship that is automatically there, but nonetheless, it is literary. And there is a question of how much can we rely on it if you want to reconstruct the battle. So now I'll get to the final point, which is the reconstruction of the battle. I think here we again can go to extreme detail. I have done so partially in the early 2019 book, but even there, my interest was on the question of Ramesses II as a leader, as a fighter, not the exact minutiae of how the battle occurred. I know that Peter Brand has done that very successfully in his forthcoming lengthy book on Ramesses II. That it wasn't my interest in 2019, nor it wasn't my interest in 2020. In 2020, it was trying to come to grips with the structure of the narrative. And here I wish to take that a bit further. I am not that overjoyed, shall I say, to deal once more with the minutiae of the battle. I am more interested in its perception by us as a literary text, that it isn't a document in terms of having typical documentary evidence, like a papyri dealing with records of accounting or the like. It isn't a documentary evidence at all. It isn't an eyewitness account, although one would like to have a bit more about that. You will find it very difficult to actually establish a time frame, although we all do we not? From kitchen onwards, the time of day up to around 5:30. Yes, but this is rough. We don't know besides that. We actually don't know in terms of the mentality of the other side. When did Muwatallis send it? Why did he send it at a certain time? Everyone says to get to the camp, but he had to go through Division 2. Could he not send it across from Kadesh the Old upwards and across to the camp? Rather than downwards and across the river, which is the normal reconstruction that's given, and then going through number 2, or was his purpose to go through number 2, or the like? We don't know. Or maybe I'll leave that alone. I don't wish to go into reconstructions of the battle, but simply is to stress the idea of what I call internal focalization, and to link Ramesses II with earlier pharaohs is part of the whole study that I've done. But here, I wish to simply keep to the theme. After all, it is Ramesses II, third, fourth, if you wish. It's the Ramesside period. It isn't Thutmose III. It isn't Kamosa. But I would have to say, and the real thing is that the text itself of the poem is unique. But after that, we can see parallels there. As I say, the Israel Stele is one, Meneptah's texts are another. There's some texts that Virginia Condon published that are similar to the miscellany texts. They can be put together, I think, more conveniently now as part of what is occurring in the Ramesside period. However, I have no answer to the question of why the different structure of narrative presentation has emerged, at least by the third pharaoh of Dynasty 19. For those interested, this is the use of the Sejemef continuing all the way down, and that would get me too much into Wente 1959 and Vinan 2018 on the narrative sequential formations. I think I wanted to end roughly around now, because I did note time is always of the essence. And I was a chair once and I couldn't kick someone's rear end. This is the truth, that kept talking on and on. I think it's obligatory that the speaker thank right at the end, Mohammed, thank you very much, Ridham, and the whole group behind you. And it's exactly 34 minutes. Thank you very much.